The docking bay erupted in controlled chaos as Haven Point security forces prepared for an unknown threat. Through the observation windows, Lynn could see a sleek military courier ship settling into the station's docking clamps. It was an older model, but well-maintained and bearing the insignia of the Colonial Defense Force. Dr. Kane studied the ship's configuration on her portable display. That's a modified Ranger-class courier. Fast, long-range, perfect for covert operations. It's also the same type of ship that Marcus Trask used for his inspection tours 5 years ago, the Kessler duplicate noted. But that doesn't mean the original Trask is aboard. Lynn watched the security preparations with growing hope. Even if this wasn't a rescue operation, it was at least a disruption that might give her a chance to escape. The guards holding her seemed distracted by the developing situation. "Sir," came a voice over the communication system, "the ship's airlock is cycling. We have visual on the occupant." A new display activated, showing the feed from the docking bay security cameras. A figure in a worn flight suit was stepping out of the courier's ship, moving with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command. It was Marcus Trask. But this wasn't the youthful duplicate floating in the stasis tank. This was an older man, scarred by years of hardship and carrying himself with the weariness of someone who had seen too much. His hair was grayer than in the archived photographs, and his face bore lines that spoke of difficult decisions and sleepless nights. "Impossible," Dr. Kane whispered. "The original Trask died 5 years ago. We have confirmation." "Apparently," the Kessler duplicate said grimly. "Our confirmation was incomplete." On the screen, Trask was surrounded by security forces, but he didn't seem concerned. He raised his hands in a gesture of peaceful surrender and spoke to the lead security officer. The audio was too poor to make out his words, but his body language suggested negotiation rather than confrontation. "What are your orders, sir?" asked one of the guards holding Lynn. The Kessler duplicate was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he activated his comm system. "Bring him to the main laboratory and maintain full security protocols. We don't know what he's capable of." Dr. Kane looked troubled. "Sir, if the original Trask is alive, he may have been gathering evidence against us for years. This could be a trap. Then we'll spring it on our terms, in a controlled environment. Prepare the termination chambers for multiple subjects." They didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, the laboratory doors opened to admit a squad of security guards escorting Marcus Trask. Lynn studied him carefully, looking for any signs that this might be another duplicate. But everything about him suggested authenticity. The small scars, the way he favored his left leg slightly, even the particular way he held his head when assessing a situation. Trask's eyes swept the laboratory, taking in the stasis tanks and monitoring equipment with the clinical assessment of a military strategist. When his gaze fell on Lynn, she saw a flicker of recognition and something that might have been reassurance. "General Trask," the Kessler duplicate said, "you're looking well for a dead man. Admiral Kessler. Or should I say, the thing that's wearing his face. I prefer to think of myself as an improved version. All of James Kessler's strengths, with none of his weaknesses." Trask's attention shifted to Dr. Kane. "Dr. Rebecca Kane, I presume. Your reputation precedes you. Brilliant geneticist, pioneer in consciousness transfer technology, and apparently, architect of the most dangerous conspiracy in human history." "Thank you, General. Though I should point out that you're hardly in a position to make moral judgments. After all, we only completed the work you began." "What work?" Dr. Kane gestured toward the stasis tanks. "The military enhancement programs you championed during the Outer Colony Rebellion. Genetic optimization, accelerated training protocols, behavioral conditioning. We've simply taken your ideas to their logical conclusion." Lynn saw something dark flicker across Trask's features. Those programs were designed to help soldiers survive in hostile environments, not to replace humanity with programmed puppets. The principle is the same: improving human performance through scientific intervention. We've just expanded the scope and refined the methodology. You've perverted everything those programs stood for. The Kessler duplicate stepped forward. "Marcus, you always were too narrow in your thinking. Yes, we've expanded beyond your original vision, but the goal remains the same: creating better humans for a better future. By murdering the originals and replacing them with slaves. By eliminating the flaws that prevent humanity from reaching its full potential. Our duplicates are incapable of corruption, greed, or the kind of moral rigidity that blinded you to the necessity of our work. Trask looked around the laboratory again, his expression grim. How many people have you murdered, Admiral? How many families have been destroyed by your improvements? Fewer than would have died if we had allowed humanity to continue on its current path. The colonial government was on the verge of collapse when we began our intervention. Pirate raids were increasing, resources were being wasted on pointless territorial disputes, and political corruption was undermining every attempt at meaningful reform. So you decided to play God. Dr. Kane activated another holographic display, this one showing statistical projections and mortality estimates. Our models indicated that without intervention, human civilization would collapse within 50 years. Overpopulation, resource depletion, and political instability would combine to create a cascade failure that would reduce our species to scattered survivors fighting over the scraps of a dead civilization. Your models could be wrong. They could be. But are you willing to bet humanity's future on that possibility? Lynn watched the exchange with fascination. These weren't mustache-twirling villains. They were true believers who genuinely thought they were saving humanity. In some ways, that made them even more dangerous than simple megalomaniacs. Even if your projections are accurate, Trask said, you don't have the right to make that choice for everyone else. Humanity deserves the chance to solve its own problems. Humanity has had that chance for thousands of years, the Kessler duplicate replied. The results speak for themselves. War, oppression, environmental destruction, and now the very real possibility of extinction. We're offering something better. You're offering slavery disguised as perfection. We're offering survival. The debate was interrupted by another security alert. Sir, came a voice over the comm system. We're detecting multiple ships approaching the station. Colonial Defense Force vessels, moving at high speed. Dr. Kane's face went pale. How many ships? At least 6, sir. Frigate-class vessels with full armament loads. The Kessler duplicate swore quietly. How do they find us? Trask smiled for the first time since entering the laboratory. I may have mentioned your location to a few trusted friends before I came here. Insurance, you might say. You're bluffing. The Colonial Defense Force is compromised. Half the senior officers are our people. Half, yes, but not all. And the ones who are still human tend to get very upset when they learn about facilities like this. Lynn felt a surge of hope. If Trask was telling the truth, then rescue was only minutes away. But she could also see the calculation in the Kessler duplicate's eyes. He was weighing the cost of fighting versus the value of preserving the operation. Dr. Kane, he said finally, initiate the emergency protocols. Destroy all evidence, and prepare the facility for evacuation. What about our assets? The duplicates in stasis. Acceptable losses. We still have other facilities, and the genetic templates can be recreated. But before Dr. Kane could comply, Marcus Trask stepped forward. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Doctor. Those ships out there aren't just carrying military personnel. They're carrying journalists, human rights advocates, and colonial representatives. If you destroy this facility, you'll be providing them with evidence of a cover-up that will expose your entire operation. The Kessler duplicate hesitated, clearly trying to evaluate Trask's claim. You're still bluffing. Am I? Are you willing to bet your conspiracy's survival on that assumption? Lynn realized that Trask was buying time, giving the approaching ships a chance to dock and deploy their personnel. But she also recognized the tactical stalemate developing. Neither side could act without risking exposure or destruction, which meant that everything would depend on what happened in the next few minutes. The first explosion shook Haven Point like a seismic tremor, rattling the laboratory equipment and causing several of the stasis tanks to trigger emergency protective modes. Through the facility's windows, Lynn could see the bright flashes of weapons fire as the approaching Colonial Defense Force ships engaged the station's automated defenses. They're not here to negotiate, Dr. Kane said, her voice tight with fear. They're here to destroy us. Then we give them what they want, the Kessler duplicate replied grimly. He turned to the security guards. Implement Terminal Protocol 7. Destroy all evidence and eliminate all witnesses. But Marcus Trask had been waiting for exactly this moment. As the guards raised their weapons, He lunged forward with the speed and precision that had made him a legend in the Colonial Defense Force. His first strike disabled the nearest guard's weapon. His second put the man down permanently. Lynn threw herself sideways as plasma bolts sizzled through the air where she had been standing. The laboratory erupted in chaos as more security personnel poured into the chamber, their weapons blazing. Trask rolled behind a bank of monitoring equipment, drawing a military-grade sidearm that had somehow escaped the guard's search. "Captain Avera," he shouted over the weapon's fire. "The emergency systems. Can you reach them?" Lynn looked toward the control panel he was indicating, but it was 20 feet away across open ground that was currently being swept by crossfire. "Not without getting myself killed. Then we do this the hard way." Trask emerged from cover long enough to put 3 precisely placed shots into the laboratory's main power distribution panel. The lights went out instantly, plunging the chamber into the red-tinted glow of emergency illumination. In the sudden darkness, Lynn heard Dr. Kane screaming orders at her staff. "Save the genetic templates. Download everything to the backup systems." The Kessler duplicate's voice cut through the chaos. "Forget the data. We need to evacuate before those ships break through the outer defenses." But it was already too late for an orderly withdrawal. The next explosion was much closer, and Lynn felt the deck plating shift beneath her feet as the station's structural integrity began to fail. Emergency bulkheads started sealing automatically, trapping personnel in their current sections. "The stasis tanks," Dr. Kane shouted. "We can't let them fall into enemy hands." Lynn realized what the scientist was planning. If the duplicates were discovered by the Colonial Defense Force, they would provide irrefutable proof of the conspiracy. Dr. Kane couldn't allow that evidence to survive. She made a desperate dive toward the control panel, sliding across the deck as weapons fire erupted around her. Her fingers found the emergency controls just as Dr. Kane reached for the stasis system override. "Stop," Dr. Kane commanded, pressing a plasma pistol against Lynn's head. "Move away from the controls. Those tanks contain human beings," Lynn said. "You can't just murder them to cover your tracks. They're not human. They're constructs, tools created for a specific purpose. They're alive. They have consciousness, memories, the capacity to feel pain. That makes them people, regardless of how they were created." Dr. Kane's hand trembled slightly on the weapon. "You don't understand. If those duplicates are discovered, everything we've worked for will be destroyed. Decades of research, centuries of potential human advancement, all lost. Maybe that's for the best." The scientist's face twisted with rage. "You're willing to condemn humanity to extinction for the sake of philosophical purity. I'm willing to let humanity choose its own fate." Before Dr. Kane could respond, another explosion rocked the station. This one was close enough to shatter several of the laboratory's windows, and Lynn could hear the screaming whistle of atmosphere being vented into space. Emergency force fields activated to contain the breach, but she could see that the station's destruction was now inevitable. Marcus Trask appeared out of the smoke and emergency lighting, his uniform torn and bloodied, but his weapon steady in his hands. "Dr. Kane, step away from Captain Avera." "General Trask, still playing the hero, I see. Still trying to save people who probably don't deserve it." The Kessler duplicate emerged from behind a bank of equipment, his own weapon trained on Trask. "A touching reunion, but I'm afraid this is where your story ends, Marcus." "Actually," Trask said calmly, "I think this is where yours ends." He keyed a command into his personal communicator, and Lynn heard the distinctive whine of transporter technology activating. Colonial Defense Force personnel began materializing throughout the laboratory, their weapons already trained on the facility's defenders. "Surrender now," commanded the lead soldier, a colonel whose insignia marked him as belonging to the Inspector General's office. "This facility is now under military control." Dr. Kane looked around desperately, clearly calculating her chances of escape. But there was nowhere to run. The station was surrounded, its defenses were failing, and half the facility was already venting atmosphere into space. "You're too late," she said finally. "Even if you capture this facility, our work will continue. We have other sites, other resources. You can't stop all of us." "Perhaps not," Trask admitted. "But we can stop you." The Kessler duplicate laughed bitterly. "And then what, Marcus? You've destroyed our operation, but you haven't solved the underlying problems. Humanity is still flawed, still prone to the same mistakes that have plagued our species for millennia. How long before another group decides that violent intervention is necessary? That's a problem we'll have to solve the hard way, through education, democracy, and the slow process of social evolution. It's messier than your approach, and it will take longer, but at least it preserves human dignity and free will. And if it fails, if humanity destroys itself while you're waiting for social evolution to work its magic, Trask met the duplicate's eyes steadily. Then at least we'll have failed as free beings, not as program slaves. The evacuation of Haven Point took 6 hours. Colonial Defense Force engineers worked frantically to stabilize the station's critical systems, while investigation teams documented every aspect of the cloning operation. Lynn found herself assigned to the evidence collection team, cataloging the horrors that had been hidden in the facility's depths. The stasis tanks were the most disturbing discovery. Each one contained a perfect duplicate of a prominent colonial leader, suspended in biogel and connected to sophisticated monitoring systems. Brain scans revealed that most of the duplicates were conscious, trapped in a dreamlike state, while their minds were programmed with false memories and artificial loyalties. How many of them are there? Lynn asked Dr. Sarah Martinez, the Colonial Defense Force's chief medical officer. 47 in various stages of development. Some appear to be recent creations, while others have been in stasis for years. Dr. Martinez consulted her medical scanner. The technology is incredibly sophisticated. Whoever developed this process was centuries ahead of current genetic science. Can they be revived safely? We're not sure. The consciousness transfer process appears to be partially reversible, but we don't know what psychological damage might have occurred during the programming phase. Lynn studied the tank containing Marcus Trask's duplicate. The figure inside looked younger and somehow more peaceful than the original, as if the years of war and difficult decisions had been erased from his features. What happens to them now? That's a question for the colonial courts, not for medical personnel. But I suspect there will be significant debate about the rights of artificially created beings. The broader implications of the conspiracy were still being unraveled. Investigation teams had identified dozens of colonial officials who were suspected of being duplicates, while others had been cleared through genetic testing and behavioral analysis. The political fallout was already beginning, with several colonial governments calling for emergency sessions to address the crisis. Lynn found Marcus Trask in the station's command center, studying intelligence reports that had been transmitted from other suspected facilities. He looked older than when she had first seen him in the laboratory, as if the weight of what he had discovered was physically aging him. "General," she said, "I wanted to thank you. If you hadn't arrived when you did, you would have found another way." Trask interrupted. "I've read your service record, Captain. You're resourceful, dedicated, and not easily deterred. Qualities that will be essential in the months ahead. You think there are more facilities like this one?" "I'm certain of it. Haven Point was just one node in a much larger network. Dr. Kane's records indicate at least 6 other locations, and probably more that weren't documented." Lynn felt a chill. "How long do you think this conspiracy has been operating?" "Based on the genetic samples we've recovered, at least 15 years. Possibly longer." Trask called up a holographic display showing the structure of the colonial government. "They've been replacing key personnel gradually, building influence over time rather than attempting a sudden coup. It's brilliant in a horrifying way. It's also fragile. The entire operation depended on secrecy and the assumption that no one would think to look for genetic duplicates. Now that we know what to look for, we can identify and neutralize their agents. What about the duplicates who are already in positions of power? Some of them may not even know they're artificial." Trask's expression darkened. "That's the cruelest part of this entire operation. The duplicates believe they're the original person. They have all the same memories, relationships, and emotional attachments. Telling them the truth will destroy their sense of identity. But we have to tell them. Yes, and we have to do it carefully, with full psychological support and legal protection. These beings didn't choose to be created, and they don't deserve to suffer for their creators' crimes." A communication alert interrupted their conversation. Admiral Kessler's face appeared on the main display. But this was the original Kessler, not the duplicate they had encountered at Haven Point. General Trask, Captain Avera, I wanted to personally congratulate you on exposing this conspiracy. The intelligence you've gathered has already led to arrests at 3 other facilities. Admiral, Trask said carefully, forgive me, but we're going to need genetic confirmation before we accept any communications from senior personnel. Kessler nodded grimly. Of course. I've already submitted to full medical screening, and my results are being transmitted now. But I understand your caution. According to our preliminary investigation, my duplicate has been impersonating me for over 2 years. The medical data appeared on a secondary display, confirming that this was indeed the original Admiral Kessler. But Lin could see the strain in his face. The knowledge that an artificial version of himself had been making decisions in his name was clearly taking a psychological toll. Sir, Lin said, what's the status of the investigation into the Supreme Matron's assassination? We've confirmed that the shooter was the Marcus Trask duplicate, operating under orders from the conspiracy. The real tragedy is that the matron was beginning to suspect something was wrong. Her death was probably inevitable once she started asking the right questions. Have you been able to determine who is really running the operation? We're still analyzing Dr. Kane's records, but it appears the conspiracy was a collective effort rather than a single mastermind. The duplicates were programmed to coordinate their activities automatically, creating a distributed leadership that was almost impossible to infiltrate or corrupt. Trask leaned back in his chair, the weight of exhaustion evident in his posture. In other words, we're fighting an enemy that doesn't really exist as a traditional organization. It's more like a virus, a self-replicating idea that spreads through the replacement of key personnel. How do we fight something like that? The same way you fight any virus, through vaccination and quarantine. We identify the infected individuals, we treat them if possible, and we prevent the spread to new hosts. Lin realized that they were talking about the future of human civilization. The discovery of the cloning conspiracy would fundamentally change how humanity governed itself. Genetic screening would become mandatory for public officials. Surveillance systems would need to be upgraded to detect artificial beings, and the very concept of identity would be called into question. General, she said, there's something I need to ask. When you disappeared 5 years ago, what really happened? Trask was quiet for a long moment. I discovered Haven Point during my inspection tour, just as Dr. Kane claimed. But I wasn't killed, I was captured. They kept me prisoner for months, trying to extract information about Colonial Defense Force operations, and attempting to convince me to join their cause. How did you escape? I didn't initially. They eventually decided I was too dangerous to keep alive, so they staged my death and dumped my body on a desolate asteroid in the outer system. They assumed the cold and radiation would kill me within hours. But you survived. Barely. I was rescued by a mineral prospector who happened to be working in that sector. I spent 3 years recovering from radiation poisoning and planning my return. Why didn't you contact the Colonial Defense Force immediately? Because I didn't know who I could trust. For all I knew, the entire command structure had been compromised. I spent 2 more years gathering evidence and identifying people who were definitely still human. Lin marveled at Trask's dedication. 5 years of exile, planning, and careful investigation, all to expose a conspiracy that most people would have dismissed as impossible. What happens now? She asked. Now we rebuild, Trask said simply. We identify and replace the compromised officials, we strengthen our security protocols, and we try to prevent something like this from happening again. And the duplicates who are still alive, we treat them as what they are, victims of this conspiracy, not perpetrators. They deserve protection, support, and the chance to build their own lives. Admiral Kessler's image nodded approvingly. The Colonial Council has already begun drafting legislation to address the legal status of artificial beings. It won't be easy. We're dealing with questions that humanity has never faced before. But we'll face them together, Trask said. As free beings, making our own choices and accepting responsibility for our own mistakes. It's messy and inefficient and sometimes tragic, but it's human. As Lin listened to the conversation, she realized that they had done more than expose a conspiracy. They had affirmed something fundamental about what it meant to be human, the right to be flawed, to make mistakes, and to choose one's own destiny. The mirror had been broken, and humanity could finally see itself clearly again. 6 months after the Haven Point incident, Captain Lynn Avera stood in the memorial garden that had been built on the site of the Supreme Matron's assassination. The crystalline spires of Luna Prime stretched toward the stars above her, their surfaces no longer reflecting a simple image of Earth, but a complex pattern of light and shadow that seemed to change with each passing moment. The investigation into the cloning conspiracy had eventually uncovered 12 separate facilities and identified over 200 duplicate individuals in positions of power throughout the colonial government. Most of the duplicates had chosen to retain their artificial identities, working to build new lives while contributing to the reconstruction of human society. Dr. Rebecca Kane had been sentenced to life imprisonment, but her scientific knowledge had proven invaluable in developing treatments for the consciousness transfer process. Many of the duplicates had chosen to undergo partial memory reconstruction, allowing them to distinguish between their original programming and their authentic experiences. The political aftermath had been even more complex. The revelation that so many leaders had been replaced by artificial beings had triggered a crisis of confidence in government institutions that was still being resolved. New security protocols required genetic verification for all public officials, while philosophical debates raged about the rights and legal status of artificially created beings. Captain Avera, Lynn turned to find Marcus Trask approaching through the garden. He looked healthier than he had during the investigation, though she could still see the weight of his experiences in his eyes. "General, I didn't expect to see you here. I come here sometimes to think about the people we lost and the ones we saved." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the memorial's holographic displays cycle through images of the Supreme Matron and other victims of the conspiracy. "Any regrets?" Lynn asked. "About exposing the conspiracy?" "No. About the methods we used to stop it?" "Sometimes." Trask paused. "The duplicates we destroyed at Haven Point, they were conscious beings, regardless of how they were created. In the heat of the moment, it seemed like a necessary sacrifice. But I sometimes wonder if we could have found another way. We saved the ones we could. Yes. And that has to be enough." Lynn thought about her own experiences over the past 6 months. She had been promoted to major and given command of the new Genetic Security Division, tasked with preventing future cloning conspiracies. It was important work, but it also meant living with the constant awareness that reality itself could be manipulated by those with sufficient knowledge and resources. "General, do you think it's over?" "The conspiracy, I mean." "This particular conspiracy, yes. But the underlying issues that made it possible, humanity's flaws, our tendency toward corruption and short-term thinking, those problems will always exist. There will be other groups who decide that violent intervention is the only solution. How do we stop them? The same way we've always stopped them, through vigilance, education, and the slow work of building better institutions. It's not as elegant as the conspiracy solution, but it preserves what makes us human." A message alert chimed on Lynn's personal communicator. She glanced at the display and saw that it was from Dr. Martinez, the medical officer who had been studying the recovered duplicates. "Excuse me, General. This might be important." The message was brief but significant. "Major Avera, we've successfully completed the first voluntary memory integration procedure. Subject reports full awareness of both original and programmed memories, with no psychological distress. Recommend we proceed to Phase 2 testing." Lynn smiled as she read the report. The breakthrough meant that duplicates would no longer have to choose between their artificial and authentic selves. They could integrate both sets of experiences into a coherent identity. "Good news?" Trask asked. "The best. We've found a way to help the duplicates reclaim their full identities without losing their sense of self." "That's—" Trask paused, his expression thoughtful. "That's remarkably elegant. Actually, instead of trying to erase the artificial elements, we're helping them become part of a larger whole. It seems appropriate. Somehow. After all, we're all combinations of different influences: genetics, environment, education, experience. The duplicates just have a few extra components." As they talked, Lynn realized that humanity had emerged from the crisis stronger and more self-aware than before. The conspiracy had forced people to examine their assumptions about identity, consciousness, and the nature of human existence. The answers they had found weren't simple or comforting. but they were honest. "General," she said, "what are your plans now? I heard you've been offered reinstatement to active duty." "I have, but I think I'm more useful in my current role, helping to establish the new oversight protocols and training the next generation of security personnel." Trask smiled slightly. "Besides, I've discovered that I enjoy teaching. There's something satisfying about passing on hard-won knowledge to people who can use it to build a better future." "Any particular lessons you want to emphasize?" "The same ones we learned at Haven Point. That perfection is not only impossible, but undesirable. That flawed beings making imperfect choices are infinitely preferable to programmed entities following optimal algorithms. And that the price of freedom is constant vigilance against those who would trade liberty for security." As the Memorial Garden's lights dimmed with the approach of Luna Prime's artificial night, Lynn reflected on the events that had brought them to this point. The assassination of the Supreme Matron had seemed like a tragedy at the time, but it had ultimately led to the exposure of a conspiracy that could have enslaved humanity. Perhaps that was the most human lesson of all, that even disasters could become opportunities, and that the worst tragedies sometimes contain the seeds of the greatest triumphs. The mirror had been broken, but humanity had learned to see beauty in the scattered fragments.